I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
For years, the paper had existed somewhere between memory and myth, whispered about behind closed palace doors, but never placed before the public. Then, within minutes, everything changed. A court ruling confirmed that Prince Philip's forbidden decree had been deliberately concealed, and that Camilla had been responsible for keeping it hidden outside the lawful royal record. But the devastating blow was still coming, because Anne was already moving, and she had no intention of protecting anyone from the consequences. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne read the judgment twice before placing it flat against the table. In this dramatized account, the court ruling meant a formal legal decision. It said Camilla had knowingly kept Philip's instruction outside the royal archive. That archive was the system used to preserve sensitive family records and directives. By blocking the document from that process, she may have altered decisions involving memorial duties, family safeguards, and responsibilities Philip wanted settled after his death. Camilla felt the danger immediately. She reached the line describing the concealment as unlawful, stopped, and asked whether the decision could be challenged. The Queen Consort received no comforting answer. Philip's decree, a private written instruction setting out how duties and protections should be handled after his death, had become more than an old family paper. It had become evidence of a choice. And that choice threatened trust, because the missing instruction may have changed who held authority after Philip was gone. Anne did not explode. She grew colder. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, refused to send an aide or accept a polished explanation. She wanted Camilla face to face, because this was no longer about procedure. It was about a daughter believing her father's final wishes had been treated as disposable. Anne requested the meeting herself, making clear that no intermediary would speak for either woman. The judgment carried one detail that changed everything. Investigators had traced the decree through its chain of custody, the documented record showing who received, handled, and transferred a sensitive item, and found that it had been removed after a request for its return had already been made. Camilla understood what that meant, and Anne understood even more. The paper had not simply vanished. Anne picked up one copied page and started toward the meeting. She carried only Philip's words, because one sentence on that page would turn a legal scandal into something painfully personal. The court had established what Camilla had done. Now Anne was about to discover exactly what her father had been trying to prevent. This was no longer simply about a missing document. For Anne, it had become a question of loyalty to a father who could no longer defend his own words. For Camilla, it threatened years of carefully earned authority. And for Charles, the ruling created a nightmare no monarch could easily contain. The woman beside him, and the sister he trusted, were suddenly standing on opposite sides of a judgment neither could pretend had never happened. Anne understood Philip through duty rather than sentiment. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the sovereign's eldest daughter, had absorbed his belief that responsibility meant carrying out an obligation even when it became uncomfortable. To her, his final instructions were not keepsakes. They were promises meant to survive him. That was why the concealment hurt. Camilla, meanwhile, knew the danger reached beyond embarrassment. Her influence depended on trust, and trust could collapse faster than status. Charles read the ruling alone and stopped when he reached the paragraph naming his wife. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the papers, and said nothing. The king, meaning the reigning sovereign and head of the monarchy, understood that the court's finding had dragged a family wound into institutional territory. When an aide asked whether Camilla should be summoned, he waited before answering. Not yet. He needed to know what had been hidden from him. Anne heard from her brother later that evening. Charles spoke carefully, but she refused to let the issue shrink into marital loyalty. She told him their father's written intent existed before anyone chose to bury it, and no marriage could erase that fact. Charles did not argue. He heard the grief beneath her controlled anger, and understood she was not chasing humiliation. She was defending Philip's right to be heard. Camilla had reason to fear discovery before the judgment arrived. A documented palace note showed she had been warned that Philip's papers were undergoing a completeness review, A formal check, confirming every expected record, was present. She knew the missing decree could surface. Yet another revelation landed harder. Charles had never received the full document. He had seen excerpts, summaries, fragments, but not the complete instruction Anne was demanding. Anne finally reached the sentence that changed everything. Philip had written directly about the future queen consort and limits on influence over family legacy decisions. Her anger sharpened into recognition. The concealment had not begun randomly. It traced back to one specific conversation, one moment when Philip decided a boundary had to be written down. To understand why his decree disappeared, they would have to return to the day that conversation changed the direction of the royal household forever. Every scandal eventually has a moment that looked insignificant when it happened. This one began during a private winter meeting, when Philip asked a question that nobody in the room expected him to ask. There were no cameras, no public statement, and no immediate confrontation. But something said during that conversation disturbed him deeply enough to put his wishes in writing. Years later, Anne would look back at that single meeting and realize it had been the true point of no return. Camilla entered the discussion, believing she was proposing order, not conflict. She suggested that future decisions involving memorial patronages and selected family archives should be consolidated under the sovereign and consort, meaning the monarch and spouse would hold authority. To her, the arrangement promised consistency. To Philip, it threatened one household gaining too much power over the memories and instructions belonging to everyone else. Philip reacted without drama, which made the moment heavier. He pushed his chair back and told the room that inheriting responsibility did not mean owning another person's memory. Anne heard every word. She had seen her father become impatient before, but this was different. His anger carried warning rather than temper. Camilla went quiet, and Anne noticed, because it was the first sign the proposal had struck a boundary Philip would not leave unprotected. Camilla confronted Charles privately afterward, and said Philip's response had felt personal. The queen consort feared the older royal was trying to reduce her future influence before she held it. Charles tried to calm her, arguing that his father spoke sharply when principle was at stake. Yet she remained unsettled, and the king-to-be understood the disagreement had become a struggle over who would control family memory after Philip was gone. Philip acted within days. He signed the fictional Family Stewardship Directive, a private decree ordering certain personal instructions to be delivered unchanged to named relatives, and barring any consort or household office from suppressing them. A decree, in simple terms, was a formal written instruction intended to carry authority beyond an ordinary request. Anne later learned from the documented archival record that her father had insisted the wording remain exact. Camilla encountered that directive again after Philip's death. During a review of his papers, she reached the clause restricting unilateral control and requested that the document be held separately for clarification. The primary packet moved forward without it. The decree never returned. Anne now had the chain showing exactly where it disappeared. More importantly, she had Philip's own words warning against the very act that followed. The past had explained the motive. The next meeting would force Camilla to answer for the choice that followed. When Anne finally entered the room, there were no lawyers standing between them, no palace spokesman, no carefully negotiated language. Camilla was already waiting, composed but visibly tense, while Philip's decree rested on the table separating them. Anne did not begin with an accusation. She began with one devastating question. Had Camilla read her father's instruction before ordering it withheld? The answer would determine whether this was misunderstanding or betrayal. Anne wanted no institutional shield around the conversation. The Princess Royal had chosen a closed palace sitting room because she wanted the truth without advisors softening it. Beside her sat the court judgment, the recovered decree, and the internal notation showing Camilla had requested the document be separated from the archive packet. An archive packet was simply the official bundle used to preserve and process important royal records. That detail mattered because it showed the removal had left a trace. Camilla answered carefully, but she did answer. The queen consort admitted she had read the disputed clause before asking for the document to be held back. She said Philip's wording created uncertainty over future household authority and insisted she had wanted clarification before the instruction took effect. To her, it had been a delay. To Anne, it sounded like something much darker. The distinction between postponement and obstruction suddenly became the entire argument. Anne placed her father's page directly in front of Camilla. She told her that delaying a final instruction until it became inconveniently irrelevant was another way of defeating it. Her voice never rose. That made the words cut harder. Camilla tried to explain that the palace had been entering a sensitive transition and that overlapping authority could have caused confusion. Anne replied that confusion was precisely why Philip had written the boundary down. The recovered decree carried an even sharper warning. Philip had specifically barred personal preference or anticipated embarrassment from being used to withhold his directives from those entitled to receive them. Anne pointed to that language and asked how Camilla could have misunderstood something so direct. The queen consort fell quiet. For the first time, her explanation no longer sounded like a defense. It sounded like an admission of fear. Anne then delivered the consequence. Because the decree disappeared, Philip's planned family stewardship committee had never been formed when intended, leaving sensitive legacy decisions concentrated elsewhere for years. Camilla understood what that meant for her position, yet she still believed Charles might protect her. Anne left before that hope could comfort her. The king had already requested a separate legal briefing. Anne had delivered the personal reckoning. Now Charles had to decide whether being a husband could coexist with being the custodian of the crown. Charles had spent years understanding that the crown demands choices ordinary families rarely have to make. But this choice was different. He was not being asked whether he believed Camilla's explanation. He was being asked whether the monarchy could continue treating a court-confirmed concealment as a private domestic problem. Sitting opposite his legal advisors, the king finally understood the danger. Protecting one person from humiliation could expose the entire institution to something far worse, an appearance of deliberate impunity. Charles listened as the legal position was explained in plain terms. The crown, meaning the authority carried by the reigning monarch and the institution around him, still left the final palace response in his hands. The court had established the concealment, but it had not decided every internal consequence. That responsibility belonged to him. If Camilla continued controlling sensitive family directives after the ruling, every future decision could be questioned. If he removed her, the cost would become painfully personal. William entered the discussion because the future of the monarchy would one day become his burden. The prince listened before speaking, then told his father that public trust could not survive one set of rules for the country and another behind palace doors. Charles did not challenge him. He knew the future king was not asking for punishment. He was warning that silence could harden into resentment and eventually damage the institution far beyond this single scandal. Charles remained seated after the briefing ended. He closed the legal summary, held it for several seconds, and whispered that Camilla should have come to him years ago. The king was wounded not only by what she had done, but by what she had hidden from him. William stayed behind. He told his father that protecting someone could sometimes mean stopping them before one mistake became the reason an entire family stopped trusting one another. Charles made the decision quietly. He authorized Camilla's temporary removal from direct control of private legacy records, sealed family instructions, and archival approvals, while a household review took place. A household review was an internal examination of royal procedures and responsibilities, designed here to determine how the failure had happened and how it could be prevented again. Anne received the second decision. She would oversee the restoration of Philip's outstanding directives, beside an independent legal archivist. The responsibility matched exactly what her father's decree had tried to protect. Camilla would soon learn that Anne, not she, now controlled the process. The decision had been signed quietly, but when it reached Camilla, the silence surrounding the palace finally broke. Camilla had survived hostility before. She had endured judgment, ridicule, and years of public suspicion. But this was different. because the rejection was coming from inside the institution she had spent decades trying to secure her place within. When Charles informed her that her access to sensitive legacy matters was being suspended, she did not immediately protest. She simply stared at him. Then she asked the question that revealed her deepest fear. "Does Anne now decide what happens to me?" Charles answered more carefully than she wanted. The king explained that the restrictions would take effect immediately, but her ceremonial position would remain unchanged. Ceremonial responsibilities were the public duties tied to royal appearances, traditions, and representation, rather than control over private records. Camilla could still stand beside him in public. She could no longer handle sealed family instructions, legacy files, or archival approvals. That difference was devastating, because influence inside the household had always mattered as much as visibility outside it. Anne began the restoration process without celebration. The Princess Royal entered the archival office beside a legal specialist and requested a complete inventory of every unfinished instruction connected to Philip. An inventory, in this context, meant a formal list of documents that should exist, where they belonged, and whether they had been completed. She rejected any suggestion that this was a victory over Camilla. Her father's wishes had been interrupted. Her task was to restore them, not enjoy the humiliation of someone else. Camilla felt the loss in a smaller moment. After Charles left, she remained seated, while an aide approached with a folder that would once have required her approval. She reached toward it automatically. The aide hesitated, then explained that it now had to go to Anne. Camilla slowly withdrew her hand. When Charles returned later, she asked whether he truly believed she had acted maliciously. He could not give her the comfort she wanted. Motive, he said, no longer erased consequence. Anne found something unexpected during the inventory. Among Philip's unfinished papers was a second sealed instruction, tied to family reconciliation and future royal roles. The discovery mattered, because this document had not been addressed to her. It had been intended directly for Charles. Anne understood the weight immediately. Her brother had not simply been denied information about palace procedure. He may have been denied words their father wanted him to receive personally. Anne refused to let another formal process swallow the message. She decided Charles would hear Philip's words from her. Camilla had lost authority, but Philip's next message would reveal that Charles had lost something far more personal. There were no courtiers in the room when Anne handed the second instruction to Charles. No lawyers, no cameras, just a brother, a sister, and the words of the father they had both lost. Charles read slowly. Halfway down the page, his shoulders dropped. Anne watched without interrupting. For the first time since the scandal began, anger disappeared from the story. What remained was grief, and the realization that the concealment had stolen more than procedure from them. Anne had insisted they meet alone because Philip's second instruction was deeply personal. The Princess Royal knew this was not another document about authority. It was a direct message, urging his children to stop arguments over status, from destroying their relationships after his death. A sealed instruction, in plain terms, was a private written message meant only for the person named to receive it. Charles understood immediately why that mattered. These were words intended for him, and he had never been given the chance to hear them. Charles reached the passage about keeping his siblings close and read it again. The king tried to continue, but his voice changed when he admitted that several decisions might have been handled differently if the message had reached him at the proper time. Anne did not press him. She had entered the room carrying anger, yet she now heard something else in her brother's voice. Regret. He was no longer defending a system. He was grieving lost time. Anne finally told Charles what she had refused to say before. She did not want Camilla destroyed. She wanted their father's wishes restored and recognized. The monarch listened as his sister explained that Philip's first decree had never been designed simply to weaken the queen consort. It had been meant to create boundaries, ensuring that no single household could control family memory, personal instructions, or inherited responsibilities belonging to everyone. Charles understood the difference at last. He told Anne there would be consequences for the concealment, but there would be no campaign of humiliation. The record would be corrected, Responsibilities would be separated. Trust would have to be rebuilt where possible. Anne agreed, because accountability and revenge were not the same thing. For the first time, the conflict stopped being about defeating Camilla and became about repairing what secrecy had damaged. Charles then approved the next step. The palace would disclose the court outcome and the reforms publicly. Inside the family, anger was finally becoming clarity. Outside the palace, the public was only beginning to understand what had happened. By morning, what had been whispered through palace corridors had become impossible to contain. The court judgment dominated royal discussion, but one detail captured public imagination above everything else. Philip had written rules designed to protect his final wishes, and those very rules had been ignored. Crowds stopped outside Buckingham Palace. Phones rose above heads. Yet amid the noise, one handwritten sign near the gates reduced the entire scandal to 4 words. His wishes mattered too. Charles approved a formal palace statement before the morning ended. The king confirmed that archival safeguards were being revised and that Philip's unfinished instructions would be restored under supervision. Archival safeguards, in simple terms, were the rules designed to track, preserve, and protect sensitive royal records, so no single person could remove them without accountability. That mattered because the scandal was no longer only about Camilla. It was about whether the monarchy could protect its own records when trust had already failed once. Anne received a photograph from an aide while leaving an engagement. The Princess Royal stopped at the image of the handwritten sign and read the 4 words twice. She then said her father would have hated the spectacle, but understood the principle behind it. Her reaction carried no triumph. She knew Philip had valued duty over attention, and the public response reminded her that his name had become attached to a conflict he never intended to create. Camilla watched the coverage alone, and heard commentators return repeatedly to the same question. How could a private royal directive disappear from the very process meant to preserve it? The queen consort switched off the television before the discussion ended. She no longer looked angry, she looked exhausted. She understood that any public attempt to defend herself now might sound less like explanation and more like refusal to accept consequence. The public mood became more complicated as the day moved on. Some voices demanded harsher punishment, while others argued that endless humiliation would not restore Philip's wishes or rebuild trust. Accountability became the stronger theme. Charles responded by approving a final settlement. Anne's oversight of Philip's legacy material would remain permanent, and Camilla would not regain control over sealed family directives. Anne accepted the decision without celebration. Camilla accepted it without public protest. Yet one final conversation still remained between them, and no court ruling could decide how that would end. The public verdict demanded accountability, but the emotional verdict could only be delivered by the 2 women who had stood at the center of the storm. The final meeting did not end with an embrace. It did not erase what had happened, and it did not magically restore trust. But it accomplished something more believable. Anne entered knowing her father's decree had finally been restored to the record. Camilla entered, knowing she would never again control the documents she had once tried to withhold. Between them stood the cost of secrecy, and for the first time, neither woman attempted to pretend that cost could simply disappear. Anne accepted the settlement without triumph. The Princess Royal would retain oversight of Philip's legacy instructions, alongside legal archivists, specialists responsible for preserving important records. From that moment forward, sealed family directives would be logged through multiple custodians, meaning no single person could privately remove or suspend them. Her father's wishes would no longer depend on one person's discretion, and the same failure could not happen again. Camilla spoke first in their private conversation. The queen consort admitted that withholding the decree had been wrong. She explained that fear of losing influence shaped her judgment, but she did not ask Anne to excuse it. Anne answered with restraint. Forgiveness, she said, could not rewrite the record, but accountability did not require endless punishment. Trust would remain limited, boundaries would remain firm. Philip's memory would not become a weapon. Charles closed the matter in a private discussion. The king told Camilla their marriage would continue, But institutional responsibility had to stay separate from personal loyalty whenever trust had been compromised. He confirmed Anne's role and approved the safeguards. For him, the decision carried a lesson. Protecting someone from consequence could become another form of concealment. Anne watched Philip's recovered directive entered into the family archive, with its original date and chain of custody restored. A chain of custody was the documented record showing who handled a sensitive item and when. She did not celebrate. She simply watched the registration finish and left, knowing the words her father intended to survive him finally had. The crisis ended without a victor. Camilla remained, but with limits she could no longer ignore. Anne succeeded because she restored her father's voice instead of using it for revenge. Charles preserved his family by refusing to confuse love with immunity. And the monarchy emerged changed because it accepted a truth bigger than any title. Loyalty without accountability can become silence. Philip's decree had been hidden, recovered, fought over, and finally honored. And with its restoration, the family could at last close the chapter that secrecy had kept open for years. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.